So this can be a challenge also in the plugin ecosystem because plugin developers need to debug their plugins within the app that they're going to load. So again, we recommend consider an out-of-process plugin model, or consider shipping a debug version debug version of your app to registered plugin developers so that they have the power to debug, but you don't ship that to all of your customers. But if absolutely necessary, the Notary service will accept the combination of the getTaskAllow entitlement and the disable library validation entitlement to allow this workflow. So finally, we'll talk briefly about protected resource access. So you all know that your customers use their Macs to store tons of information about their lives, and the Macs have access to sensors that are security sensitive. Once you've adopted the hardened runtime, your app needs to declare its intent to access any of these protected resources. So we mentioned all of these last year, but if you need to access any of these resources, you need to take the entitlement on your main bundle and then declare the usage string that is associated with the entitlement so that when your app attempts to access one of these resources, the system can provide a dialog saying, oh, this is why I need to have access to this resource so that you can collect the user's consent. So some recommendations, a summary of this section. Take only the entitlements you need. The entitlements turn off security provided by the hardened runtime, and they can be inspected by anyone looking at your app to try to see what kinds of things they can do with it once it's shipped to customers. So be careful, take only what you need, put the entitlements only on the processes that need them. If you have multiple processes, multiple executables within your app, it's unlikely that all of them need the same protections. You probably aren't doing JIT in every process. You probably aren't loading plugins into every process. So take only the ones you need in the processes that need them. And when you're declaring resource access, make sure that those entitlements are only on the main bundle of your app. Those get inherited by any other executables within your bundle, so they don't need to be all around, just on the main bundle. Now I'm going to hand it back to Garrett to go over what you need to do to actually submit for notarization.
Thanks, Robert. So now you know everything to think about while you're building and designing your application to get it ready to be notarized. But how do you actually submit it to the notary service? Well, let's talk a little bit about the notarization workflow. And regardless of whether you're using Xcode or have a custom build workflow, the rough workflow is about the same. You submit the app for notarization. You can check the status with the notary service. Once notarization is complete, you can staple a ticket. And then when you're done, you might want to verify that the stapling and notarization were successful. Before we talk a little bit more about this, we should talk about what and when to submit. And at a minimum, you should be submitting all the software that you distribute. But really, it's OK to upload more regularly. So anything that runs outside of a developer's machine, feel free to upload to the notary service. You probably don't need to upload every CI build, though. And anyone on the team can submit software for notarization. This has changed from last year, when it used to be restricted to certain roles. So now you're ready to submit to the notary service. Well, if you use Xcode, it's quite easy, and it's built into the archive and distribution workflow. So once you build an archive, you can open up the Xcode organizer like you see here. And you can select Distribute App, just like you did before with Developer ID. Select Developer ID, and then use the Upload option to submit a copy to the notary service. You'll see a progress bar during the upload, and after everything's complete, you'll get dropped back into the organizer, and you'll notice that the status has changed to processing. Once the notary service is complete, you'll get a push notification to Xcode, and when you come back to the organizer, you'll note that the status has changed to Ready to Distribute, and in the lower right corner, the Export Notarized App button is now available. When you click Export Notarized App, Xcode will take care of stapling the app for you, and what you get is completely ready for distribution. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can verify that yourself later, because that's a shared workflow between custom workflows and Xcode. Now, if you don't use Xcode, Submitting with custom workflows is equally easy. The first thing you need to think about is what you want to submit to the notary service. Now, the notary service accepts 3 main formats: disk images, installer packages, and zip archives. So if your build outputs anything but one of these 3, you'll need to convert it to one of these 3 formats before you send it to the notary service. And remember that when you're creating a zip archive, it's important to include macOS-specific metadata, like extended attributes. And if you don't know what tools to use, there's support in Ditto and Archive utility built into the operating system. Now, one other thing to think about is if you actually have a custom installer. And custom installers can be a little bit trickier if they pull down content from the internet as part of their installation, or if you use custom packaging formats. And if you have a custom installer app that does one of these things, you may need to perform 2-step notarization, where you actually take all the content as it's going to arrive on disk, submit that for notarization using one of the 3 supported formats, staple it up, and then you submit your custom installer app separately. So now that you know what you want to submit to the notary service, how do you actually do it? Well, Xcode 10 and newer contains a command line tool called AL tool that's generally used for interacting with the notary service. If you do have multiple versions of Xcode, you'll want to use Xcode select to make sure that you've selected Xcode 10 or later. And then you can use AL tool with the notarized app command. With that, you'll need to pass in the primary bundle ID along with the file that you want to upload. You will need to authenticate with your Apple ID, but if you look at the man page, you'll see the options for using the keychain or environment variables, so you don't need to always type in your password. When notarization upload is complete, you'll get a request UUID. And this is a UUID that represents your submission, which you can turn around and use with the notarization info command, also as part of AL tool, to check on the status of processing. And this is how you can find out when your notarization is complete and what the status was. Here's an example of a successful notarization. And one important thing in here is the log file URL. Regardless of whether notarization was successful or had issues, you can take a look inside of the log file URL to learn a little bit more. Now, the log file URLs are not long-lived. They only work for about a day. So really, you probably want to pass around the UUID. And whenever you call notarization info, you'll get a new log file URL. Here's an example JSON log from a successful processing. Notice that the status was accepted. Now, if this had failed, the thing that you really want to look at here is the issues array. And in a successful notarization, this will generally be empty. But if something failed, there will be an object in here, and each one represents some failure during notarization. It will indicate things like which binary may not have adopted the hardened runtime, or if something wasn't signed properly. So this will be the key if anything was rejected. If it was successful, you'll probably want to look in the ticket contents, especially if you do anything interesting around how you package your software. The ticket content should list every binary that was discovered by the notary service, and therefore every binary whose information is included in the ticket that you'll staple. So if you notice that anything is missing in the ticket contents, you may need to figure out what went wrong and try it again. Now, regardless of whether you use Xcode or AL tool, when the notary service is done processing a submission, you'll get an email. Here's an example of a success email indicating that this software is ready for stapling. Which brings us to the next step. Stapling uses a tool also built into Xcode 10 and newer called Stapler. Here you can see an example invocation of Stapler with the staple command that can be used to staple directly to a package or a disk image. Now note that you can't staple directly to zip files, so you'll need to unpack the zip file, staple the contents of the zip file, and then you could package it back up for distribution. And note that stapling of command line tools and libraries is not supported right now, even though these items still can and should be notarized. Now, after you staple, the next step is to verify that everything was successfully notarized. And this step varies a little bit based on what you want to verify. But the first thing is simple. If you really just want to check that something has been stapled, you can use the stapler tool again. Here you can see the stapler tool with the validate command to check that an item has been properly stapled. But what about if you want to verify notarization on something that you didn't put up for stapling, or that you didn't staple yourself? Well, then you'll want to generally use the spctl command, which is a tool built into macOS that runs Gatekeeper assessments. And this does vary slightly based on what you want to check for notarization. But if you want to check an application bundle, you can use the spctl command with the assess option and the verbose output and pass it the path to the application. And the source will tell you whether or not it was notarized. Notarized developer ID means that it was successfully notarized, and if it shows anything else, that means that it wasn't notarized. If instead you want to check an installer package for notarization, you can use the spctl command just like before, but with the additional type option and passing that it's an install. Again, this will show you the source, and if it was successfully notarized, you'll see notarized developer ID. Next, what if you want to check notarization on a signed disk image? Well, you can use a fairly similar command, except now you want to use the type open, and you need to pass in the context that's listed here on this slide. That will show you the same output as before, and if it says notarized developer ID, notarization was successful for that signed disk image. If you want to check the notarization status of anything else, you'll need to fall back to using the code sign command. Here's an example of using the code sign command with the verify function, with verbose output, testing a very specific requirement, notarized, and then a path to the binary or the thing that you're trying to check. And the third line of the output will say explicit requirement satisfied, indicating that the test requirement you passed in on the command line was successfully satisfied, which in this case means the binary was notarized. If it says that the explicit requirement failed, that means the binary wasn't successfully notarized. So that's everything about verifying notarization. I want to jump back and hit on one other usage of AL tool that I mentioned very early in the presentation. AL tool is also able to give you a notarization history using the notarization history command of all of the software that's been submitted for notarization on your account. Here you can see an example of the command and an example of the output. It also accepts pagination, so you can paginate through all the submissions that have been made. I know that that was a lot of information to digest in one short talk, but there's a few important things that I really want you to take away from this conversation. First, it's really important to sign your software properly using inside-out code signing. This is important not just so that Gatekeeper can verify your software hasn't been tampered with, but also for notarization. Second, don't take hardened runtime entitlements that you don't need. Think about the benefit that the hardened runtime provides to your app and your users. And remember that every entitlement you take reduces the security of your application. So only take those that you need. And finally, notarize and staple all the software that you distribute so that it passes Gatekeeper in macOS Catalina. Thanks for attending. And if you're interested in talking more about notarization, please come to the Notarization Lab that's going to be following the session immediately at 4 o'clock. Also, there are a couple of other labs running throughout the week where we can talk more about security, notarization, and signing. So, thank you.